respective communities. At the core of our work is the desire to center voices that have been historically marginalized or silenced. We truly believe in the transformative power of good journalism to help marginalized community reclaim their narrative, assert their rights, and speak truth to power. In Canada, Black journalists play a vital role in promoting their community's narrative sovereignty, challenging misrepresentation, and empowering Black communities to define themselves. We're here today to discuss the essential role that Black journalists play within the Canadian media sector and the challenges they face, as well as their achievement. I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to our moderator, panelists, and each of you for being part of this vital conversation. We are currently live on YouTube and across Journalists for Human Rights channel. This is a fantastic opportunity for those of you who didn't register to still be part of the conversation. Please take a moment to share this live event within your network. Let's spread the word and ensure that as many people as possible can benefit from the insight and discussion taking place today. This event will not have been possible without the generous support of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and CanadaLand. Now I'd like to ask Mohamed Hassim, the Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, to share his remark with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everyone to come together. My name is Mohamed Hashem. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas, the Credit First Nation here in Toronto, also under Treaty 13 land. We're in such an important time when the voices of journalists are ever so vital to the functioning of our democracy. But more so, and even in particular, the voices of diverse the voices of diverse journalists in the newsroom are so important. Pasant Batar wrote a seminal piece in the Walrus a few years ago, where she argued that the lens of fairness and neutrality within the reporting of news was a standard held in a way that silenced some voices and provided safety to others, and that those decisions were in many ways based on race and were racist. Today, in this polarized world, we need real truth tellers, even when it is uncomfortable, because without you, the writing is right in front of us. We are entering a world of disinformation, misinformation, and common beliefs that are absorbed through political intent versus fact. We need you more than ever. So thank you for coming together for this important event, and for all of you who are looking to build your professional voices. Don't linger from the industry in the face of layoffs or other things, but rather look for the opportunities and create your own if you need to. But let's make sure truth is told and that everyone's truths are told. So thank you very much for having me, and we look forward to this amazing event. And also a big thank you to CanadaLand, as well as Journalists for Human Rights, for partnering with us. This is a phenomenal opportunity, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. Now I would like to introduce our host for this discussion, Adrian Warehood. Adrian brings a wealth of experience to our discussion with over 25 years in journalism, including significant roles at CBC Ottawa. Adrian is currently an associate professor at Carleton School of Journalism and Communication, and also a valued board member at Journalism for Human Rights. Thank you very much, Adrian, for joining us today, and over to you.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Aisha, for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Diverse Narratives, a dialogue on Black journalists in Canadian media. We are thrilled to have you join us for what promises to be a very important conversation as part of our celebration of Black History Month. This event is brought to you by Journalists for Human Rights in partnership with CanadaLand and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Our goal today is to explore the experiences, achievements, and challenges faced by Black journalists in Canadian media. And we've assembled a distinguished group of panelists to achieve just that. First, we are honored to have Angeline Francis, a multimedia team editor at the Toronto Star, where she focuses on video production. Angeline's journalism career is marked by her dedication to reporting on equity and inequality issues, with a particular emphasis on race. Her work as a video producer for Maclean's magazine and as co-host of the HuffPost Canada's award-winning podcast, Born and Raised, has significantly affected Canadian media. In 2021, Angeline's contributions were recognized as she was named one of WXN's top 100 powerful women in Canada. Next, we welcome Amara Bangura, the Director of Operations at Journalists for Human Rights, who brings a wealth of international experience to this panel. Originally from Sierra Leone and now based in snowy Halifax, Amara has an extensive background in community engagement and public service journalism across Canada, the UK, and several African countries. He has over 15 years of experience, including work with the BBC, JHR, and community broadcasters. Amara specializes in governance, conflicts, human rights, and health-related emergency reporting. He has had a long-standing commitment to empowering underserved communities and telling their stories. And finally, joining us in about 20 minutes will be Nathan Downer, the co-anchor of Toronto's most watched local newscast, CTV News at noon, and also CTV News at 6. Nathan's extensive career includes roles as an anchor and reporter for CP24, where he covered events from elections to the Toronto Raptors 2019 NBA championship win. I don't think they're going to win a championship this year. His contributions have been recognized with awards from the RTNDA and accolades from the African Canadian Achievement Awards and the Black Business and Professional Association. Nathan's dedication to informing, engaging, and communicating with the community through his work and charity involvement showcases his commitment to journalism and social impact. So those are our panelists. And today we're going to dive into the indispensable role that Black journalists play in enriching our media landscape with diverse perspectives and stories. We aim to celebrate their successes and address the hurdles they encounter in their professional journeys. So I thought I would start with Angeline. And the question is this, Angeline, in your experience, how do Black journalists influence the representation of Black communities in Canadian media?
I think that whenever you have people who are members of a community, their stories come up more and are pitched more often, they're acknowledged more, and I think they're covered with a better perspective, having had a whole life and a whole breadth of experience and a whole rapport with different community members, and knowledge, I think, of all the different work that's been done over the years. So I think that there absolutely needs to be Black journalists in newsrooms all over this country, just because we have more things coming through our head that are related to Black Canadians and Black people who are living in these communities. And we definitely do improve, I think, the frequency with which our stories are told, and then the quality of that reporting too.
And so the expertise that these journalists have matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it takes a lot of time to learn those things on the fly. And when I was covering equity issues, I think that's part of the reason I focused a lot on Black stories and stories that were related to women. And I did my best to tell stories from other communities that I'm not part of. But I came upon a learning curve for sure. You have to learn the different terms that are evolving within that community. Like, for instance, I was in the process of covering more stories that I realized that the disabled community often prefers that term to people with disabilities, which is a bit more legal and less colloquial a term. But being a Black woman, being a Jamaican woman who grew up in Toronto, I had a little bit of a window into a lot of different stories that relate to my community. And it helped, I think, throughout my career.
Mm-hmm. Mara, the same question for you. In your experience, how do Black journalists influence the representation of Black communities in Canadian media?
Well, we have to look first. Thank you to all of you. I think this is an opportunity for us to engage. Having platforms like this in the first place is where I think it's beneficial for us, okay? In the first place is we have to look at each other in terms of how we tell our stories. If we want to look at the representation, and representation here as Black people of color, right? We understand the content and context of the stories we are telling. We live in the communities. We share a lot of things in common with the people from whom we are getting the story. So it's a matter of we understand the story, we are processing this story, and we are dishing out the story for the good of the people where we get the story, and for the good of the people who are going to read this story, who are listening to this story, who are going to view this story. So having a group of Black journalists to be able to serve as a link between the community where they are from and the end users or the receivers of this story helps a lot in terms of representation. So when you ask what, I mean, the influence that Black people bring in, I think it's beneficial for both communities, the communities that we represent and the communities that for whom we are telling the stories.
Mm-hmm. You know, we often talk about the fact that presence matters, right? So the presence of Black journalists in newsrooms matter. The presence of Black journalists in the Canadian media landscape matters. What happens when the Black journalists are absent? What's the consequence of that? What's the significance of the absence of Black journalists from these spaces? Angela?
It's huge. Angela, please.
No worries. It is massive because I even think about it in the context of the fact that I'm not reporting as much anymore, but I am editing stories. I have colleagues reach out to me to ask me to read over some of their stories and see what points they're missing when it relates to the Black community. If it's renaming Dundas, well, at the time it was Dundas Street, now Dundas Square. Whether it's policing and Ferguson and the impact that that's had on our community. I'm still here to be able to offer that perspective to my colleagues. And I can think of so many different instances of either missteps or thin reporting or things that predate me at the Star, but I remember specifically our coverage of the Somali community related to Rob Ford's scandals was heavily criticized by that community. And I think that's definitely a consequence of not having, at the time, I guess, enough Somali reporters or anybody who could maybe point out that, ooh, this could be a stigmatizing framing for an entire community. I think it absolutely makes all the difference in the world when we have diverse newsrooms.
Amara, what's the significance of the absence of Black journalists?
Yeah, it's huge. To Angela's point, when Black voices are missing in the media, one, it affects the threshold of representation, right? We, like I said earlier on, we have the context because we live with these communities. But also, to the example that Angela just said, having reporting on persons with disability, on how they want to be referred to as, like maybe they want to be seen as persons with disability or person living with disability, all those kind of like descriptions, right? If you don't live with these communities, you do not understand. There is always some element missing in the way you tell those stories. But having those people who live within these communities, who interact with these people on a daily basis, would be able to bring into life some of the context that some of our colleagues wouldn't have. It would be also considered, consider we live in a community of all Black people, and we always see people of different background coming to get stories from us and telling us. I would one day ask myself, what happens to me or to people like me? Why are they not here? Why are they not asking me questions that other people are coming to ask me and then share my story? You know, there is also the issue of building confidence within communities. If I see someone like me, I feel comfortable to talk to them a lot. It's easier that way. But if we see some other people, like I said, I'd always ask myself, what is it? Where are my people? Why aren't they here? And when I do not have those questions, those answers to those questions, I'll begin to create a lot of doubt and it's important to have to clear those doubts.
Yeah, to add to
But,
that too,
Amara, you're not saying, Amara, that non-Black journalists can't effectively cover Black community.
That's not the point. No, that's not the point at all. They certainly can, all right? But what I am saying, yeah, they should, obviously. What I'm saying is, if today it's the same, tomorrow it's the same, I'd feel like a voice is missing. I want to be represented, all right? And if I don't feel represented, but my story is always out, I'd ask myself, how is this story covered? Why is it covered? And who is covering this story? For me or for who else? And you need answers to those questions. And when you do not have answers, then you begin to have doubts in the way sometimes the stories are told and who is telling your stories.
Mara, I thought of an example when you were talking, actually, just because I think it kind of illustrates this point, not just in telling our stories where us and our identity and the Black community is at the center of it. I can think of so many times when we're looking for voices for a story about schools or about any random story that relates to all of Toronto, all of Canada. And we often do call outs among our peers and among people who work with us. Say, do you know anybody who might be able to speak to me for this story? And if most of my colleagues are white, most of their circles are also white. And then the people that we end up speaking to for our stories are from within the same community. Versus an instance can come up where it's the anniversary of gay marriage being legalized in Canada. And I can think of like, oh, I have a friend and or her wife, maybe they would speak to you for this story. And that brings some Black queer voices into the star that may not have been there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very pleased to say that Nathan Downer from CTV, the co-anchor of CTV News at noon and CTV News at 6, has joined us. Nathan, thanks so much for coming on board.
It's a pleasure. It's great to finally chat with you. I'm a fan of your work.
Oh, you're very kind. You're very kind. Nathan, the question that we're addressing right now is the significance of the presence of Black journalists in our newsroom and in the Canadian media landscape. So the significance of the presence and also the significance of the absence of Black journalists. Can you address that?
Man, I got to say the questions, first of all, I'm so glad I'm here. It's a pleasure. I love being Black and I love working in the news business. As far as addressing the importance of Black journalists, it's vital. We have a different lens. And I think our role is to look at everything and make sure that we are not promoting stereotypes oftentimes, or not using language that we don't use in other stories. And so I think for me, I would say when you're in the business, as you all know, if you're in it, you have to be prepared to realize that you can encounter racism at any point, any day, at any time. And it might not happen for weeks, and then it might happen suddenly. It could be in a story that you're looking at. It could be in a way that something is written. It could be an interaction with a colleague. It could be multiple things that arise. So you just have to prepare for that, among every other thing that you prepare for as a journalist.
Nathan, can you bring us into the CTV Toronto newsroom and tell us, give us a concrete example of how the particular lens that you look at the world through made a difference and had an effect on the way in which maybe a story was told, or maybe how a story was not told?
Great. So I could go on and on, Adrian. So I'll go with one. Bruce McArthur, he's a serial killer, and he's caught. And every time we do a news story about him, we show Facebook photos of Bruce McArthur, not a mugshot, just Facebook photos. You would think this guy himself was a victim because of the photos that we're showing. Fine. We show a Black suspect, and it's an automatic mugshot. The question viewers have, anyone who's conscious, why aren't we showing the mugshot for this white victim? But when it's a Black victim, the mugshot is there. Where are the Facebook photos? So I went to management and said, we need to have some sort of policy. There's got to be consistency. I'm not saying it has to change for Black people. It's got to be the same. That's all we're asking for, consistency. So in other words, if we're going to show a Black suspect, I want to see Facebook photos, characterize them as a human being, as we do with a serial killer. And if we don't have a mugshot for Bruce McArthur or any other suspect, we need to somewhere on our screen note that police have not provided a mugshot. And if we don't do that, the perception people have is we are making a conscious decision to not show a mugshot. So what we need is a mugshot policy. And this was something I took right to management and something that we've actually changed. Another thing when it comes to mugshots, and I say that because oftentimes Black people are overrepresented in our prison system, and we are more likely to be charged by police. So there's a greater chance for a Black male to even have a mugshot. We're showing mugshots of Black victims oftentimes. These are victims of crime. Why are we showing a mugshot of something that happened maybe 20 years ago? So what I've basically said is, look, if there's a suspect out there who's been captured and is not a threat to the public, no more mugshots. There are news agencies that have what are called mugshot policies. So they are not going to show a mugshot of anybody unless it's necessary, unless they are a threat to the public. Part of the problem in the society that we live in is there's a stigma specifically around Black men, that they're violent. And oftentimes the media perpetuates that stereotype. So what I try to do is to eliminate that. That's one example. I'll give you another example. Let's say someone has a mental health episode, and they could be Black, or let's say they're Black, and police arrive, there's something happens, and there's a shooting. Police have shot someone who had an episode, and there's a press release from police, and they say that there was an altercation. But you talk to the family, and they tell you a different story. How are we going to write this story? Are we going to simply say that there was an altercation? Well, altercation suggests that there was a fight. So what we have to do, just one simple thing, is just change the wording. It's an interaction. Oftentimes I've had to say we can't confirm an altercation. That suggests there was a fight. Change that word to interaction. There was an interaction, because we don't know what really happened. So what we have to do, or what I do on a daily basis, with joy and glee, by the way, is make sure that we're being fair and impartial with our stories and with our wording. If a suspect is Black, we can't describe him as Black, violent, and dangerous, when with the exact same act is committed by a white person, we say armed and dangerous. In fact, to present this and say we can't over-stigmatize Black suspects by the wording. So I think that's just one small, narrow aspect of what I do in my role, which is a privilege to have, is to make sure that we're simply fair with the language. I can tell you another story. We've done stories about suspects who are white, who were teenagers, and we're describing them, 18-year-olds, as these young boys have been charged, these young boys. Black person, 18, he's a man. This man's been charged, 18, 19. I'm asking for consistency. So and these are emails sent right to the top of the chain. For any suspect who's 18, we have to decide, is it a man or a boy? And if the answer is it's a man, for all 18-year-olds, we're going to describe them as men. But these are the things that they don't have the same lens that I have. And sometimes they might not see it. And they're accustomed to doing it in a certain way as far as the writing goes. So that's just a few examples of what we can all do, or what I do on a daily basis that I see all the time. And again, we can go on, and I'll tell you, I can go on and on, Adrian.
We're going to come back to you.
I'll tell you another story. I saw this just a few days ago. There was a story about these 5 white hockey players that played from the World Junior team that had been arrested. And I was watching another news agency cover it. And I'm watching this interview taking place. And the expert said, hey, when it comes to sexual assault in athletes, typically we see Black athletes, people like Mike Tyson and Kobe Bryant. And I was shocked that the person doing the interview didn't push back and say, not always the case. It can be any ethnicity when it comes to sexual assault. I've done stories about hockey players before. We've done stories about gymnastic coaches, NHL hockey coaches. There's no limit to the type of person that can be charged with this. The man promoted a stereotype on live TV and the interviewer didn't say anything. So my point is, when I say be prepared to encounter it, even when you're speaking with a guest, be prepared and you have to push back. You can't just sit there with your mouth closed, allowing your so-called expert to promote a stereotype.
Right.
These are the things that happen sometimes on a daily basis. Sometimes you don't see it for weeks, but these are the things that can happen. And what I think is, for me, most important is getting policy changed. And I've said this over, whenever I get asked to be on, the CTV fireside chat, my first thought is I don't want to chat. What I want is change. No more talking. How much talking do we have to do? I want to see, will this change policy? And if the answer is yes, I'm on board. If the answer is no, then I don't want to be a part of that. I want policy change, Adrian.
Nathan, we're going to talk more. We're going to talk more.
All right, sure.
About things. You've kind of, you've laid down the gauntlet, the proverbial gauntlet there.
We could talk this one question.
Amara,
we could go on and on
Nathan,
hours on that one question. Because there's a multitude of places where it could go. Sorry, go ahead.
Indeed. And Nathan, I want to Amara, because Nathan is a person with power, right? Nathan has some power in his newsroom. Nathan is the co-anchor of the CTV newscast, right? Which means that he has a little bit of heft, right? Yeah. He's talked about how he intentionally intervenes, right? That like as a journalist, as a Black journalist within his newsroom, he has intervened in significant ways. I want to ask you this question. What do you see as being the role of the Black journalist in Canada, right? What should be the kind of raison d'etre of the Black journalist?
Yeah, I think Nathan touched on that. Sometimes just raising a voice when you see things going the wrong way, it's important. Like you said, you don't need to sit and wait for someone to correct your story, to correct an idea that you already know it's going wrong. For Nathan, he has the power to raise his voice. I'd encourage every other Black journalist. You may not have Nathan's power, but if you are in the newsroom or wherever you find yourself, it's important to find your place and be able to raise a voice. Just feel comfortable. You may be challenged in many ways, but it's important to be able to find that space and raise a voice. Correct issues before they go too wrong. They could go wrong, but before they go too wrong, be sure to find a space and raise that voice. I'll give you an example, and similar to what Nathan said. I didn't have much power, but when the Ebola outbreak hit my country, I returned to Sierra Leone to report on that. The reporting was completely different, and I got a lot of calls from Canadian journalists who were like asking for the story. We want this story. How many people have died today? How many people have died today? All right. And every day I was telling people, this number of people died, this number of people died, this number of people died. But it got to a point I realized that why are people just interested in the number of people that have died? What about local initiatives that have been taken to prevent or stop the Ebola from spreading? And at that point, because I thought like, you know what, I'm just going to say this and I'm going to continue with this anymore. So that was myself using my power to say, no, I'm not going to do this any further. And it's just as simple as that. I know there are other challenges there, but say no when it's no. When you feel uncomfortable, when you see things going the way you feel you are being misrepresented, or your community is being misrepresented. And I looked at some of the stories that were being told of the Ebola outbreak, and I was like, this is not the story, but I understand this is what you want as a story. The only power that I had then was to say no. And I ended it right there. Right. So again, I'd encourage, it's a challenge, but I'd encourage people to raise a voice. And if you can't, you raise a voice and you find yourself in a situation, it's okay to say no.
Yeah. And Angela, there might be some Black journalists out there who are watching, who are saying, and I don't mean to embarrass Nathan, but they might say, I'm not Nathan Downer, right? I'm not the anchor of my newscast, right? I am a middle-ranking journalist in this newsroom. What can I do as a Black journalist? What would you say to that person?
Well, I think that we like just to even set the stage for it too. The Canadian Association of Journalists started collecting data on race and diversity in newsrooms that is meant to be self-reported by newsrooms. So it's not full, it's not necessarily extensive. It depends on who responds. But from what they do collect, they see that Black journalists are more likely to be part-time and interns. So most of the Black journalists who are working in newsrooms in Canada are in those precarious positions. Like, I think very often about the fact that I'm the only full-time Black woman at the Star in editorial, apart from our editorial assistant. It is not a position, it's not a position without power to be in the room at all. I think that even if you are present and you're in a precarious situation, and if you feel like you don't have as much of a voice as some other people in the newsroom, it's still worth speaking up. I don't think that it leads to as many repercussions as we might think. I think we're at a good time in history right now where there have been some unmistakable instances where newsrooms across here and the States have proven that they're not great at covering Black issues. Like, case in point, and Nathan's comment about police coverage, I always am so mind blown to see what the police press release of George Floyd's murder was initially, and then what actually was revealed when we all saw video footage of how he was killed. So I think that since something like that has proven at such a wide scale that these newsrooms are not doing a great job, if you point it out and you try to honestly save them from embarrassment, it should honestly be welcomed. But if you are concerned about speaking up and about not feeling like you don't have a lot of power in your newsroom, I think there's power in numbers. So I think it's always very helpful when my colleagues and I all kind of get together. When you find the allies in your newsroom or the people who are in your community in these newsrooms or part of other racialized communities, it's really helpful, even if just for venting on the little day-to-day things, to get together and figure out ways to raise your voice together, whether you write a collective letter or email all together to the people in power in your newsrooms, or if you're a reporter and you just make those very distinct decisions with how you cover your own stories, like how you want to describe the people, who you want to quote first in your stories, who you want to even seek out as an expert interview in any of these stories, because I always would seek out women and racialized people first when I was looking for an expert on anything. I really respect the lifestyle journalists I know who look for Indian wedding planners to quote in their stories, because why not? It doesn't make sense to limit your scope. So I think there's a lot of ways, whether it's just in doing the day-to-day work or when you want to speak up about something. I think just find your people, find the people who will be receptive to what it is you have to say. And those things are totally within reach, even if you're a younger person or someone who is more precariously employed.
Nathan, what do you say to those kind of precarious, Black journalists, those Black journalists who might not have the job security, right? That you maybe have. What do you say to them when they suggest that it's difficult for them to assert themselves in the ways in which you're asserting yourself? How do you respond to them?
I understand fully. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say first off, I understand fully. I didn't start off as a news anchor. So like most people that started off at the bottom, I had to work my way up. And just like what Angeline said, first off, you can control what you're doing with your own stories. So I would do things like seek out Black experts on every story that we covered, just to normalize seeing Black people on television. Yes, you want to look for allies as well. You also want to be great at what you do. You want to earn the respect of your colleagues. You want to be a hard worker producing great work, great stories. All those things combined, it affects how they see you. And when you've got a solid reputation in your newsroom, it helps just with your voice overall. And also how you present it, as it's something positive. For me, when I used to work at Global News, one of the things I did was I went out to various communities, starting off with Black communities. So I went to the Jamaican Canadian Association, the BBPA, the host of Black groups, and I did a presentation explaining why we need you as an expert to be in our stories. And I'll explain why. I was doing a story about some sort of legal story, and I wanted to find a Black lawyer, just to have a Black lawyer, just simply because I wanted to see a Black face as an expert. Too often in the news, we see Blacks as victims, but not as experts, not as heroes, not as just people in the street, taxpayers, etc. So I wanted to just get a lawyer. I called a few Black lawyers that I knew, and I was getting no's. No, can't do this, can't, no, sorry, can't make it. And I would call lawyers from other communities, and I would get an immediate yes. So what I realized was, I didn't blame them, but I thought, let me do a better job explaining what's involved. So I did a presentation for the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers on my own. And I explained, when you get a call from the media, here's how it works. We're not asking you to comment on your own case specifically. We're simply asking you to interpret the law. So if a bus drives by and splashes me with water, can I sue the transit authority? Do I have a case? Can I have them clean my laundry? We just want to get your professional opinion as a lawyer. And here's what other people have done. And then I actually showed a few stories showing what the lawyer's role is, how long the interview is, where we can do the interview, and how you can benefit from it. And how lawyers were putting those interviews on their website and how it helped them generate business. So sometimes it just could be us. We might have to reach out and maybe go above and beyond to explain what the role is. But that was something that didn't require management. It didn't require me to be in a position of power. I was a reporter, but I thought, hey, I'm going to reach out to various communities to beef up my Rolodex so that when I'm doing a story about health, we can find a Black doctor. If we're doing a story about anything, you can get a Black expert, and let's beef up the Rolodex. My boss, a news director, was so impressed when I told him what I was doing, he suggested other ethnic groups get approached. And it became this huge initiative for everyone, South Asian, Asian, Indigenous, every community you can think of, reach out, explain what we do, and beef up our Rolodex, because it just makes us all do a better job of reflecting our viewers. And that's what we're trying to do, is a smart business decision to reach out to various communities. You got to stay connected and to get their contact information. Again, these were things that I started off myself with little to no power, because I understand what it's like when you're in a newsroom and someone who doesn't look like you is pitching a story, telling you what your angle is, saying, go to this community and this is how they feel, when you know it's not true. But when they do tell me, hey, do a weather story or do a story and get people's reaction to FIFA coming, I can go to a Black neighborhood and talk to Black business owners. You don't only have to go there when this perception is, oh, this is a Black story, so go to the Black community. Go on any story. Jane and Finch gets weather. I've had to say this to my news director. They get weather at Jane and Finch. Do your weather story from there. And they laughed and said, you're right. There's all kinds of things that we can do without, I would say, without having a lot of power. But we do have power. You're working in this business.
The history of Black journalism and Black journalists in this country goes back about 170 years. You know, the first Black newspaper was launched in the 1850s, Voice of the Fugitive. We know that Marianne Shadd Carey, you know, started the Provincial Freeman. We hear of people like Carrie Best, right, who published the Clarion newspaper.
Yeah, in Nova Scotia.
In Nova Scotia, and on that first issue was a picture of Viola Desmond. We know of papers, for example, like Contrast, which was the most significant, you know, Black Canadian newspaper in the 1970s and late 60s, 70s, and 1980s. These papers, these journalists have always played a role of kind of defending the community, right? Of being advocates for the Black community, of ensuring that the stories of Black communities are told. The question I have is in 2024, what kind of Black journalists and what kind of Black journalism do Black communities in Canada need, right? What kind of journalists do Black communities in this country need? Amara?
I think we need people like you. We need people like Nathan, and we need people like, I mean, with all these brilliant initiatives, right? Nathan just gave us...
and Angeline.
Of course, and Angeline, yeah. I definitely will come to Angeline, definitely. You all just gave us some brilliant examples that are brilliant. I mean, Nathan's brilliant initiative of going to the communities. asking them, what is the story here? Talking to people and telling them why they should share their stories. All right, that's important. And then going to one community and saying, this is the story that I have. I want us to work together on this story. That's important. And you now, like with all your experience, having worked with people, we also need people like you who many other journalists who look at and think, I want to be like him. When I grow up, I want to be like Adrian. I want to be like Angeline. I want to be like Nathan. We want these examples. Okay, we need more people that would inspire young people, more young Black journalists coming up to look at and say, I want to be like this. I want to be able to represent my community. These are the initiatives that I am bringing up. These are the initiatives that these people have built on for us. This is the foundation that I am coming to build on. Okay, we need just that.
Angeline?
Adrian, I think about your question and it sends my brain in a lot of different directions because I think about it primarily from a Black audience perspective and what Black Canadians and readers want to read and need to read, or watch, honestly, as well. And when you mentioned contrast and about how it was predominant in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I think about what society looked like for the Black community at that time. And in all honesty, I don't think it's changed as much. I think it has changed in some regards, but I think that we still face these same issues. What Nathan was talking about, the perception of Black people being more heavily criminalized. And it's evolving with how society is changing. I'm working on a few stories that have to do with artificial intelligence and how that's evolving and how race plays into that and how poorly tailored to Black people and people with darker skin these different kinds of functions and features are. Like I used a hand soap tab the other day and I am like as pale as it comes and it still wasn't recognizing my hands when I put it underneath it. I just think about it in so many different ways. So I think what we need is stories that still advocate for us. I do think that that is a particular role that journalism does serve. And I would love for the industry to better serve that function by not pretending that that's not part of what we do to an extent. I think when we get so wrapped up in the idea of objectivity, just displaying the facts as it comes, that is an element, and fairness is always going to be an element of what we do. But I think that the reason we do stories is because we think it's important. And I think if you think it's important and you wanted something to be affected as a result of the story, that is a bit of a form of advocacy. So I think that that function still exists. I think that we need to think about ways to engage Black audiences from mainstream news organizations. I mean, that's where Nathan and I both work. And it feels like our readership and the people who will pay to watch or have a cable channel in order to watch the news, it feels like we still kind of primarily target white Canadians as opposed to Black Canadians. And I think we need to challenge ourselves more to tell stories that are relevant to Black communities, that advocate on behalf of Black communities, and that can reach Black communities. And with all of that, considering different class elements that are within that community. Because when you're spending an hour and a half on the TTC commuting to work, how do we reach the people who have to spend that time and spend a lot of their time working? How do we reach them and have them spend a little bit of that precious time reading our publications and watching our stations? Like all of these things I think need to be at the forefront when we think about how we're connecting with Black communities.
Nathan, the same question for you. What kind of Black journalists do Black communities in Canada need?
Ones that are connected to the community. So it could be something as simple as reading papers that are owned by Black people and going to events, just being out there and being accessible. You can't sort of close yourself off to the Black community and then say that you're going to somehow represent them. And also understanding that you can't do everything. I work at a mainstream large news station. So we are not necessarily doing a lot of stories about individuals. Not that many. Most of our stories are the big ones. What happened at Queen's Park? What happened at City Hall? So what I try to do, because I'm not doing stories anymore, is making sure that you see a lot of Black representation in the stories with the experts that you see, even in the graphics. We've done stories where, you'll see me at the anchor desk and you'll see a picture of people behind me. We could be doing a story about an increase in taxes and you're showing business owners, or we're doing a story about COVID and we're seeing maybe doctors. The graphics, I'd say before I got here, were mainly white. I've had to go to management and say, you got to diversify the graphics that are behind me. It needs to look like Toronto. We need to see brown, we need to see Black, we need to see women. We can't just show white men as doctors. So that's just one thing. So I think for me, it's not just telling one story every once in a while. And that's what we sort of do at my shop. One story every once in a while isn't enough. For me, representation is in every story, every opportunity you possibly get, you're putting Black representation in there. And that could be graphics, it could be experts, it could be the neighborhood, it could be the streeters, the people that you're talking to. We want to normalize seeing Black men and women on camera. We can't only show them in one criminalized role, which was too. There was a time when Black people would cringe when they see a Black person on television, thinking, oh, shoot. Hopefully that has changed. And that's what we try to do. I'll give you another example. Running up to the past few elections, I noticed I just didn't see a lot of Black political experts. And the response I got was, well, we can't find them. I can find them. So I made it a point to go out and find Black political experts that can talk about what they think and pontificate about the upcoming election and give us their opinion. And guess what? The reception was great. In our business, a lot of times there isn't a lot of time to find someone. But when you have people who are media ready and you've got a phone number and they know how it works, I'm seeing people that I've picked out being used often now in television, here on CTV and also on CBC and other networks. And that's just a success.
Yeah,
I take that with pride when I see people that I've found who are now seen on television on a regular basis leading up to an election, giving us their opinion. So what is our role? I think our role is to stay connected, but also take the initiative, take it upon yourself and connect and find the experts and get them on camera.
Speaking of our business, this is a difficult time for the journalism industry. The media industry this is an industry in crisis. We've seen in the last couple of weeks, the slashing that took place, with Bell Media, like the owner of CTV, right? Getting rid of lots and lots of journalists, and hundreds of journalists. CBC has also announced cuts. We're seeing cuts in other newspapers, other media platforms across the country. And so there might be some young people who aspire to be journalists, young Black journalists out there who are saying, is this really the industry for me? I'm not sure if I will be able to secure a livelihood if I enter into this space. There are a lot of parents out there who are at this moment, discouraging maybe their students from going to Carleton University, right? Because they're going to say, don't go to Carleton's J School. You're not going to get a job if you go down that path. So the question, Angeline, is what are some emerging opportunities that might exist for Black journalists in this particular moment? Are there opportunities for Black journalists?
This is hard. This is a very hard one. And I talked to a lot of university classes and college classes about the industry, and it's definitely a hard time. But I find it funny because I think that mantra of it being a hard time has been ongoing since 2008. It definitely is what I was told when I was graduating school and went to TMU for J school. I kept hearing about how competitive the industry is and how challenging it can be. And I kind of think of all of my classmates who I graduated with, and it's a mix. There are a lot of people who pursued journalism and a lot of people who pursued communications or teaching or different industries entirely. But I think that it served as a really good base education, regardless, you learn to be a really good communicator, a really succinct storyteller. And those skills, I think, are really transferable. But for myself, at least, like since I went into this industry with that warning that, oh, it's so competitive, and it's so insecure these days, I think when you're young is a great time to take risks anyway and pursue these different avenues of life. I went into this industry thinking that, okay, well, I still want to do it. I want to try it. I want to say I've done it. And if I want to do something else, I'll do something else. So I wouldn't take it as a means for young people to be discouraged, because I've also had the pleasure of connecting with different Black women writers in this industry who don't do this full time, but have made it a point to freelance and do different kinds of arts coverage and music coverage, and maintain that consistency alongside doing other work. So I think that there's different ways to pursue this as a career, and it doesn't have to be a full-time one. It doesn't have to be in Canada. I've also seen really cool stories of people who have made this kind of an international job and maybe relocated to Kenya to be a photojournalist and work on freelance in a place where the cost of living is lower. I think that it is a industry, like you said, that is in crisis. But there are a lot of smaller, also new upstarts. I think it was called the New Republic or something like that. I came across one that was founded by, I think, the daughter of Google, of a Google executive who formed this company that tells stories about tech as it affects different countries around the world. So what's the story of how tech is evolving in China, in India, in Africa? All these different kinds of opportunities I think are coming up, because I think people recognize that this industry, the world would be a dire place if this industry just up and disappeared. and we're seeing how that's come up. It's been fascinating to me, pretty much entering this industry at a time where the president of the United States was on the news constantly saying that the news was fake. And how that's really impacted trust in our industry. So it's a volatile time, but I don't think that the dream is lost for young journalists who want to pursue this and want to tell stories from their community. And I think this whole discussion, we've talked about why it's important that Black journalists still are able to enter this industry and find support in doing so.
If I could just jump in there, right? I think that's a really interesting question. And like you rightly said, it's an industry in crisis. People are losing their jobs every other day. But we have to think about this in a different way. Does this mean we should give up? Certainly no, I'm not. And I wouldn't encourage anyone to give up, because we still have our stories that we need to tell. We need to be able to tell the stories from our communities. But what can we do about this? When I look at even those of us seated here, I feel there is a lot that we have to share. If I want, like, looking at Angeline here, I want like a video team editor, right? I want you to mentor me on that. I want to be able to see someone that I could provide mentorship for me. I want to be able to go to Angeline and say, hey, I know you have this skill. Can you mentor me on this? What can I learn from you? What is the business like? How can I develop myself, my skill, to be able to share stories from my community? From my community. I want to be able to come to you, Adrian, like, you are a professor at this university. Let's talk about what the business is like. Let's talk about this industry. What are the opportunities there? What mentorship can you provide for me? All right. It's the same thing for Nathan. So I wouldn't entirely just say, I'm not going to give up. And I wouldn't encourage anyone to give up. What I would encourage every other Black journalist to do is, let's have conversation with our senior colleagues, people who already are in the business. What are the opportunities there? How can I explore some of these opportunities? How can I develop my skills? How can I tell these stories from my community using the skills that I get from XYZ? So I do think there is an opportunity there. Even though things are challenging, it's tough. It's a business that is in crisis, but we also need to engage others and see what opportunities that are there. And mentorship could be the way to take that approach.
Nathan, how can young, emerging Black journalists take advantage of some of those opportunities that might exist within the Canadian media landscape?
I guess, like what Angeline said, when I was coming into the business 20 years ago plus, it was also, I was told it was shrinking. And I was told that, there's already a Black man on TV and, one's enough. That was sort of the attitude that some people had. But my attitude was, and this is the attitude that you should have, the business needs you. You're unique. You've got your own lived experience. You've got all of the tools that you bring to the table. The business needs you, and you got to have a passion for it. So the advice I would give to someone new trying to break in, learn everything. Okay, when I was coming up, I worked in radio, I'd worked in print, writing for a magazine, and I'd done some television as well. And when I finally got in with a news director and we had a conversation about what do you want to do, I told him I want to master the media art. I want to do everything, not just one thing. And he says, really, you sound like me. This is an old white man. And he says, you sound like me when I was your age. I'm like, great. So I would say if I was trying to get into the TV business, I would say I want to learn how to shoot, like with a camera, learn how to cut and edit, learn how to voice. You want to learn how to do as much as you can, do everything. Also, when you get a break, make your deadlines, be reliable, be punctual, be easy to work with, increase your viability, make it so that they cannot imagine not having you there. Don't just do the bare minimum. So do as much as you can so that you're doing everything you can to secure your spot. No guarantees. I know we are not the boss and we don't have complete control. And yes, anyone can get cut, and that's sad and that's difficult. But I would say increase your chances by doing more than what's required and learning as much as you can in the business.
I want to switch gears a little bit because we're living in dark times right now. We're living in a very, very difficult, geopolitical moment. Black journalists, Black Canadian journalists have always played an outsized role in telling stories about international affairs, whether it was the role that Black journalists played during the apartheid years in South Africa. We know that since the massacre of over 1,000 mainly Jewish Israelis on October 7th, we've seen the slaughter of some 30,000 Palestinians, and about 12,000 of whom are children, right? And I'm curious as to what you see as being the role of Black Canadian journalists in the war that's happening in Palestine right now. So maybe I can begin with you, Nathan.
I think the role that I have is the same role that anyone should have, to be fair, impartial, and to present the information. If you watch our newscast, everything you just said, Adrian, you'll see in our newscast. You have to attribute, of course. If this is coming from officials in Gaza, you got to put that in your newscast. So you just have to make sure that you're covering both sides of this controversial, sensitive issue, but you're including it. You're not covering something or not covering another side. You're including it in the newscast. So I'd say your job as a journalist, period, is to make sure you cover both sides of this conflict.
Are you confident that journalists in this country have been telling the story effectively of what's going on in Palestine?
Well, there's always room for improvement, but I'll say this. This is the first time we've covered anything where no one's happy. The reaction we get from the Jewish community oftentimes is critical. The reaction we get from the Palestinian community oftentimes is critical. And that's a good thing. There's no side in this conflict that is happy with media coverage right now, because it's very, very controversial, and it's very difficult to be perfectly, to make everyone happy. So the fact that neither side is really happy, I think, is a good thing. I'm proud of the coverage that we've been given, because we're showing, if there's a protest, we're showing it, and we're doing the interviews on either side. And if something happens in the Middle East, we're showing it and we're presenting it.
Amara,
so there you go.
Yeah.
Amara, what do you see? What do you see as being the role of a Black journalist in this particular instance? And maybe to counter Nathan a little bit, not everyone would necessarily say that it's controversial what's going on. I'm curious about that.
What I mean is the reaction that people have to it. I mean, the way it's presented, it can be a trigger. So you see the way that people are reacting to the way the story is presented. I'm not saying what is happening is controversial, but the way it's being presented, the UN, what they've had to say, the way that is covered. There are so many aspects to this. To say that it's not controversial, you can play with the language in any way you'd like, but it's a very sensitive topic. It's been that way, come on, for decades, not just today, but it's been that way for quite a long time. So it's a challenge.
Amara, do Black journalists have a particular role to play in telling the story of the war, Israel's war in Palestine right now?
I think every journalist have a role to play in telling the stories coming from that part of the world. If I go there to tell a story, or if I go to tell a story, I go to tell the story. And as a Black journalist, it depends on where I am telling the story, for whom I am telling the story. Like if my target audience is the Black community, I would want them to know what is happening in the story. So I find a neutral ground, I find a neutral place to tell the story. It's important for the Black community to hear what is happening, to know what is happening. And it is important for a Black journalist to be able to tell these stories. So I do think there is a space for Black journalists to be to tell the stories there, and I believe the Black community would benefit a lot hearing from Black journalists. But it's like Nathan said, it's important to find the neutral place to tell these stories. Understanding that, like he said, it's very sensitive at the moment, and so I mean, you can understand why people shy away from that.
Why? Why do they shy away from it? And I'm going to ask this question because, I remember the 1980s. Like, I remember how the apartheid story was told. The Black journalists that I was reading and learning from, they didn't use the term controversial to describe what was going on in South Africa. It was clear what was going on in South Africa, right? There wasn't any talk about fairness necessarily, right? It was black and white. It was clear what was going on, right? In terms of what's going on in Palestine right now, we know that 12,000 children have been slaughtered, right? We know that hospitals are being destroyed, right? We know that. That's not controversial. So is there a particular role, that a kind of a moral role that Black journalists, given the experience that Black journalists have had, is there a particular role that Black journalists need to be playing at a time like this?
Well, you have to report it.
Yeah,
I think it's very simple. Forget the word controversy for a second. You have to report what's going on. Our job is to report. And we do that every single day. Report it.
I do have a few thoughts on this, honestly. And I think maybe I could start by actually framing it in just a couple of adjacent stories before I get into actually the question of what is on the table. I remember when I was in my undergraduate degree in journalism, and I was actually considering whether I wanted to enter the industry at all. But there was a book that I came across that was called Kill the Messenger. It's not the one that's about the crack epidemic in the States. It's written by, I believe, an Armenian professor, and it examines the role of journalism in the media or journalism across history, fairly recent history, and how media has either helped end moments of human suffering or contributed to it. And every chapter was a different case study. So they went through Rwanda, they went through Bosnia, they went through the Holocaust, they went through the workers' movement in Mexico. I think it was Zapatistas was what they were called. They went through climate change as well. And I found the climate change chapter particularly interesting as an example of the time when journalism has both sides an issue, when that isn't what we should have done. What wound up happening a lot in the interest of trying to display people who were warning that the earth was warming, this would be the downfall of humanity, and had scientific backing to enforce that. We also had to find someone who was trying to say that this wasn't an issue. And we actually lost a number of years in how we could have been covering climate change and changes in the environment because we were very stuck on this instance. And I think earlier in our conversation as well, we spoke about how as journalists, you are making certain calls. You're making them with fair judgment that I don't think the average person in society has in their toolbox or as part of their day-to-day tasks. We approach things with fairness, but we do approach them with, there are certain calls that we make. There's perspective in what we cover. And that comes up in who we choose to speak to and how we amplify these voices. And I will say that on this topic in Canadian media, for years and years, and what I've observed as a student up until my time in this career, we have never, I think, really covered the topic in a way that is in true proportion, I think, to what has happened. We're always a little focused on equality rather than equity when we cover this issue, I think. And with that in mind, when, like you said, Adrian, there are 12,000 children who have been killed, there are continued military operations that are being put forth by a government despite a ruling from the International Court of Justice that said such actions need to stop. When we see these things going forward, and what, again, that same court has determined to be a plausible genocide, I think that it is our responsibility to draw these parallels to history, to imbue a certain amount of perspective so that we can report fairly on what is going forward, on what is happening, and report on what is the most urgent, I think. Because I think that what we really need to understand and redirect our attention to is the fact that what is happening currently is a military bombardment that should have ceased. What's happening?
Yeah. Thank you. I do want to include some of the questions from our audience. And so there's a question here about the role of allies. And the question is, how do you get allies to also do this work in ways that are meaningful and effective? How best for allies to engage so that you are not the only ones doing the work to ensure stereotypes are challenged and that coverage is fair, consistent, and genuinely balanced? Amara, do you want to tackle that question about allies?
Sorry, can you read that question again, please?
Yeah, it says, how do you get allies to also do this work in ways that are meaningful and effective? How best for allies to engage so that you are not the only ones doing the work to ensure stereotypes are challenged and that coverage is fair, consistent, and genuinely balanced?
Amara and Adrian, would you mind actually if I picked up on that for a second? Just because I think it does tie into...
Yes, please do.
It ties into, I think, what we were just speaking about, because as Black people, we are not Palestinian and we are not Jewish or Israeli, but it's a matter of, serving a bit of the position of an ally, I think, when it relates to the story that's going on in Palestine. So our role in coverage there, I think, is to offer our perspective to senior leadership and to raise our voice, I think, when it may feel intimidating or challenging for people who are directly involved in that community to raise it. I think it is particularly common when it comes to Israel and Palestine, that it almost seems like there's it almost feels like there's a particular amount of fear that I think our Arab and Muslim colleagues have when they want to raise issues with coverage. So I and other allies in the newsroom may want to be that voice. And
I think the question was really about the challenges, and thank you for that answer, Angeline. But I think the question was really about the challenges that Black journalists are facing within the Canadian media landscape, and the role that allies of the Black community or allies of Black journalists could be playing in trying to advance the cause of Black journalists.
And there's a parallel there, I think. So I think that comes from, I mean, I comment all the time, or not all the time, but when I came into the Star, I got this job because there was a manager who sought me out. There was a manager who said, we don't have enough diverse perspectives in this newsroom. Jobs come up so infrequently, and I'm going to seek out and find different younger voices from racialized communities who can come out here. And this is a white man. And as a result, I was hired And so was another white woman alongside me who had a lot of international experience, and a Muslim woman who wears a hijab. And these new perspectives were brought into that newsroom because this person spoke up and tried to make that a priority in the hiring process. So that's one instance in which I think it needs to just be at the forefront of our colleagues who are not Black in these newsrooms to advocate for us to be hired, to advocate for our stories to be covered, to cover our stories themselves and be okay with potentially making a mistake, and as opposed to just not touching the story with a 10-foot pole. Those are just some small ways I think that that I would appreciate allyship in this industry.
I
Amara,
think
and
if I
then
can chime in as well.
I'll just
Go ahead.
Oh,
go
thanks,
ahead,
Nick.
Amara.
Yeah, I was just gonna say my answer to that is let's learn together. If you're an ally, it's important to learn from it. It's important to learn from these communities. It's important to hear from these people, your friends or whoever that is around you, learn from that, what their perspective are, what the stories they are telling, how they want to tell the stories, how they feel about issues, and provide the necessary supports that you can. It's important for us to have conversations, even platforms like this. Let's share ideas. Let's feel comfortable to talk to each other rather than create assumptions of how I feel and how you feel, or how you assume that I want to be represented in a certain way. So without these conversations, we wouldn't be able to. But however, whatever allyship you want to create, right? If we do not have this conversation, there is always going to be either mistake A, mistake B, or stuff like that. So it's important to learn from each other. It's important to have this conversation, understand how I feel about things, and I understand how you feel about things, and then we can start from that.
Nathan?
I'm just going to add everything that you both said. And also, for me, it's just positive feedback. If an ally or someone does a story that I think does a great job as far as representation, or is fair, or I love the coverage, or I love seeing the diversity in the story in multiple ways, I will give them feedback and say, that was fantastic. That's what we're talking about. You hit the nail on the head. That's what we're looking for in the Black community and in the BIPOC community. Keep it up. Because sometimes maybe you need a little bit of guidance. But so in part, positive feedback, and also conversations, people you talk to in the newsroom or wherever you work. Eventually, you should know who your allies are, and then you work with them, and hopefully you can share some ideas.
We have a question from my hometown, Ottawa, from Sarah Onyango, a great community leader in Ottawa for 3 decades now. And Sarah asked this, she says, Nathan talked about tips he provides to Black experts whom he engages for his coverage. But do the panelists have advice for people in the Black community trying to pitch stories and events to mainstream media?
Yeah, send me an email or give me your card. Tell me what the story is. So yeah, send me an email. You have to reach out. I've said this to friends of mine who have stories. Don't just target one media outlet. Target all of them. You don't know what they're covering that day, and that might be the story that they're looking for. But what I also try to stress is I would rather see you on my newscast once a week than once every few months with a story. So what I find very effective is when I'm in touch with the community, finding out what they do for a living as a profession, so that if we're doing a story about the housing market, we can find the Black agent or the Black mortgage broker and put them on. That's, to me, goes much further than a story that we do in mainstream media that might be once in a blue moon. For us, for print or for a smaller paper, that is different. But send me an email, send me a DM. Part of our job as a reporter or an anchor is being connected to the public, period, especially your own community.
Angela?
I think sometimes it comes down to, kind of understanding how newsrooms work and how different publications work and what they would be looking for. So I find a lot that at print publications, we don't always do a lot of event-based coverage. So I think in pitching a story, whether it's a story that you want to tell or a story that you're hoping to have covered, you have to think, I think, about what larger message is coming alongside this story. if you can offer potential people to speak to outside of whoever is just involved with the immediate community event. I could think of an organization whose team I think does this really well. It's the Holland Bloor View Clinic, I believe. They've reached out to me before when they were doing an art gallery or there was an art exhibit of pieces by patients that spoke about sexuality and disability. But as opposed to pitching me on this art gallery that they're putting forth, they said, wouldn't a story about what sexual education is like in the disabled community, wouldn't that be cool? Perhaps you could speak to this person and this person and this person who also happen to have pieces in this show. So as a result, I'm talking about the show, but it also is a larger story that is embedded there. And I think who you reach out to could be handy to know. I think it's worthwhile reaching out to reporters directly who may have a little bit more time to sift through emails versus assignment editors who go through hundreds and hundreds a day. So I think not being discouraged if you don't hear back from somebody, but trying different pillars in the newsroom may help you get a good response.
Right, and it's so broad. It's hard to give a perfect response because you might pitch the perfect story and still it might not get covered because there's a snowstorm. But I would say, generally speaking, in the news business, we're looking for people impacted by the story. We're looking for a subject, not so much an expert to wrap a story around. So if, let's say, you've got a camp and you're running this new camp and you want us to do a story about it, well, we wouldn't want to just talk to a camp counselor and that's it. We want to talk to the kids. So we'd want availability. We want to know when we can come. We want permission. So all those factors are a part of it. So you might have this great story, but if you're not giving us a subject to talk to, it might not get covered. So part of what we can do, being in the business and being connected to the Black community, is to sort of explain, well, this might be what's missing. Or if you invite these people to your event, then there's a better likelihood of getting coverage. If you get this person to host or MC the event, it might increase your chances. But again, I'm speaking in such broad terms that I have to figure out exactly what you're talking about, and then I can probably address it more specifically. But that's just sort of a general response.
I'll just give you a quick example. When I was a producer in London for a show, what we did was to create what we call community correspondents. These are just people we identify in communities. So if like community representative have story ideas and they cannot reach the media directly, these are people that they go to easily and can pitch their stories, and these people can reach out to the media because at the end of the day, the journalists want the story from the community, the same way the communities want their stories to be told. So there has to be a point of contact. So having this community correspondent or whatever community point of contact also helps in addressing that a lot. And we did that and it worked for us. So I do believe if some Canadian media thinks about this and try to take that approach, it could work.
Yeah.
And also timing of it, just one other thing. So if you're pitching a story, you sometimes got to be creative and it's got to be timely. So if it was, yesterday was Valentine's Day, if you had some sort of Valentine's theme in your story, it might have been covered simply because we want to do a Valentine's Day story on Valentine's Day. So sometimes it's just the timing. And if you can take advantage of the timing, it could be March break or school's out or holiday season or a special event. Sometimes those are the things and those are the ways that you can get media attention.
We're rapidly running out of time, and I just want to check in with the boss, Aisha, to find out if do we have time for another question, Aisha, or do we have to wrap up? Do we have?
I think we can take one last question.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Yes.
There's a question here from an anonymous attendee, and the attendee writes, regarding allyship and the coverage of sensitive topics such as Palestine, what do you envision Black journalists' role in coverage of growing anti-LGBTQ2 S+ rhetoric, movements, and provincial policies across Canada? Maybe I'll start with you, Angeline.
I think that's it's a very good question. It's becoming more and more urgent, I think. At the Star, we have different kinds of training sessions from time to time that our management organizes to really refine our skills on feature writing, on graphic visualization and things like that. And the team at Pink Triangle Press, which runs Extra, and I believe a few other publications, but it's Canada's queer media I'm blanking on the term, media organization. It's Canada's queer media organization that I'm familiar with. They ran a workshop for us about covering queer and trans communities, and it was really relevant to the time period. I guess it was in September when there was a lot of marches and protests about which thing was it, but it's just become such a flashpoint in this season. It's similar, like these things are so cyclical, because I imagine this was a situation in the 80s as well. Like it's always come back around. But they were able to give a number of our reporters a workshop to make sure that our coverage, to spot issues that we in our past coverage and how to correct it going forward, and how to work with interviews with different people, because again, we're telling a bunch of different perspectives on this story. So how to properly frame things as opinions, which are based in facts, or beliefs, which are beliefs. It was a really, I think, illuminating workshop that I think other media outlets should seek out. And for just the average Black reporter or somebody covering this, there are queer people in our community. So it's not even necessarily a form of allyship. It is a form of representing the Black community in all of its breadth. So it is absolutely something we should be covering.
You know, what I think the last 90 odd minutes has demonstrated is that we need to convene. We need to commune more. We need more of these kinds of conversations, these gatherings. Thank you all. You know, thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Angeline. Thank you, Amara, for a very enriching, a very provocative, heartfelt conversation. I hope that the audience has benefited from this as much as I have. So thank you for your contributions. But more importantly, thank you for your work. Right? Thank you for intervening on behalf of our communities. Thank you for asserting yourselves. Thank you for taking up space, right? Thank you for being the leaders that you are, you know, and I know that for a generation of young, aspiring Black journalists, the three of you set the standard, right? And people are watching you and hoping to model their own careers on yours. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to pass the mic, the proverbial mic, over to Aisha.
Thank you very much, Adrian. What an insightful conversation. I really enjoyed every minute of it. I would like to extend my deepest gratitude for our distinguished panelists, you as well, Adrian, and Mohammed Hashim, for their invaluable contribution. A heartfelt thank you to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and CanadaLand for their partnership and unwavering support. And also thanks to CCR Solution for their technical support. Finally, journalists are instrumental to building a just society. Please consider supporting journalists working in some of the toughest environments worldwide. You can make a tax-deductible donation by scanning the QR code provided or visiting our website at www.jhr.ca/donation. Your contribution makes a world of difference to us and to journalists risking their safety for the truth. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for